Imagine a place so shrouded in darkness that even the Vatican's ancient walls tremble at its mention. A room hidden deep beneath the holy city, where screams were silenced and secrets were buried forever. This is no myth, no ghost story whispered in the dead of night. This is the tale of the Pope's torture chamber, a place so horrific. Its existence was erased from every record, yet its shadow lingers in the annals of history. Who could have imagined that beneath the sacred halls of St. Peter's Basilica, a chamber of unspeakable cruelty thrived? A place where faith was twisted into torment, and the hand of God was replaced by the grip of iron. Let me take you back, centuries ago, to a time when power wore a holy mask, and the truth was more dangerous than any heretic's lie. Picture Rome in the late 1500s, a city pulsing with devotion and dread. The Catholic Church stood as the unshakable pillar of the world, its word law, its judgment final. Popes were not just spiritual leaders. They were kings, warriors, and executioners of divine will. But in the shadows of their golden thrones, a darker force stirred. The Inquisition was at its peak, rooting out heretics, witches, and anyone who dared question the Church's authority. Trials were held in secret, and confessions were extracted not with mercy, but with pain. This was the era of fear, where a single accusation could drag a man, woman, or child into a nightmare from which there was no escape. And at the heart of this terror, buried beneath the Vatican itself, was a room no one spoke of, a chamber designed not to save souls, but to break them. Our story begins with a man named Matteo, a humble scribe who worked in the Vatican's archives. Matteo was no saint, but he was devout, his life dedicated to preserving the Church's sacred texts. His hands, stained with ink, spent years copying manuscripts, his eyes straining in the dim candlelight of the archive vaults. He was a quiet man, unnoticed by the powerful cardinals who swept through the halls, their robes trailing like shadows. Matteo's world was one of parchment and prayer, a simple existence that shielded him from the storms brewing above. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One autumn evening, as the air grew heavy with the scent of rain, Matteo stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. It was a misplaced ledger tucked behind a shelf of dusty tomes. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a forgotten record of tithes or indulgences. But as he opened it, his heart began to race. The pages were not filled with numbers or names of donors. Instead, they detailed a series of interrogations conducted in a place referred to only as the chamber below. The descriptions were chilling: iron clamps, racks, and tools designed to purify through pain. The ledger spoke of prisoners, some accused of heresy, others of crimes as vague as disobedience, who were taken to this chamber and never seen again. Matteo's hands trembled as he read further. The orders came from the highest authority, signed with the seal of the Pope himself. Who could Matteo turn to? The Church was his life, his faith an anchor in a world of chaos. To question the Pope was to question God. Yet, the words in that ledger burned into his mind, each one a dagger to his conscience. He began to notice things he'd once ignored: the guarded whispers of the Vatican guards, the sudden disappearances of those who spoke too boldly, the way certain corridors were locked at night, their keys held only by the Pope's inner circle. Matteo's quiet life was unraveling, and with every passing day, he felt the weight of a truth too monstrous to bear alone. As weeks turned to months, Matteo became obsessed. He spent his nights poring over the ledger, cross-referencing names and dates with the archives. He discovered patterns: priests who vanished after questioning church doctrine, scholars whose works were burned before they could be published, even nobles who had crossed the wrong cardinal. All roads led to the chamber below. One name appeared again and again: Father Lorenzo, a confessor known for his zeal in rooting out sin. Lorenzo was no ordinary priest. He was the Pope's enforcer, a man whose piety was matched only by his cruelty. Rumors swirled that Lorenzo could make anyone confess, that his methods left no mark on the body but shattered the soul. Matteo's fear grew, but so did his resolve. He began to seek out others who might know the truth. He approached a fellow scribe, an old man named Giovanni, whose hands shook not from age but from secrets he'd carried for decades. Giovanni warned Matteo to stop, his voice barely a whisper. "Some truths are not meant to be uncovered," he said, his eyes darting to the shadows. "The chamber is real, and those who seek it never return." But Matteo couldn't stop. He felt as though the screams of the chamber's victims were calling to him, demanding justice from beyond the grave. One night, Matteo made a fateful decision. He would find the chamber below. Armed only with a ledger and a flickering lantern, he slipped into the Vatican's lower levels, a labyrinth of tunnels rarely seen by anyone but the guards. The air grew colder, the walls damp with centuries of secrets. His footsteps echoed, each one a reminder of the danger he faced. As he descended deeper, he found a heavy iron door, its surface etched with symbols he couldn't decipher. His heart pounded as he pushed it open, the hinges groaning like a dying breath. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his days. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with instruments of torment. Chains hung from the ceiling, their links stained with rust, or perhaps something worse. A wooden rack stood in the center, its surface worn smooth by countless victims. In the corner, a brazier glowed faintly, its embers still warm. Matteo's lantern cast shadows that seemed to writhe, as if the room itself were alive with the pain it had witnessed. And there, on a stone table, lay a journal, its pages filled with confessions extracted through agony. Each entry was a testament to the chamber's purpose, to silence, to control, to erase. As Matteo stood frozen, a sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate footstep. He turned, his lantern trembling in his hand, to see a figure in the doorway. It was Father Lorenzo, his eyes glinting with a zealot's fire. "You should not be here," Lorenzo said, his voice calm but laced with menace. Matteo's mind raced. He clutched the ledger to his chest, knowing it was his only proof, his only weapon. But Lorenzo stepped closer, and the chamber's walls seemed to close in. Matteo had uncovered the Vatican's darkest secret, but at what cost? Would he become another name in the ledger? Another soul lost to the chamber below? The truth Matteo uncovered was not just a room, but a system, a machine of fear that kept the Church's power unchallenged. The Pope, revered as God's voice on earth, had sanctioned this horror, his signature a death sentence for countless souls. Matteo's discovery was a spark in a world of shadows, but sparks can ignite fires, and fires can burn empires to the ground. What would Matteo do next? Would he flee, carrying the ledger's secrets to the world? Or would he face Lorenzo, a man who saw torture as salvation? The chamber's iron door had opened, but for Matteo, the real prison was the choice he now faced. Let's step deeper into this abyss. Matteo's heart was a drumbeat in his chest as he stood before Father Lorenzo, the ledger his only shield. The chamber's air was thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves exhaled the terror of those who had suffered here. Lorenzo's presence was like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of violence. "You think you found something," Lorenzo said, his voice smooth as a blade. "But all you found is your own ruin." Matteo's knees trembled, but he held his ground. He wasn't a hero, not a warrior, just a scribe who had stumbled into a truth too heavy to carry. Yet in that moment, he felt the weight of every name in the ledger, every life erased in this godforsaken room. Matteo's mind flashed to the stories he'd read in the archives, tales of martyrs who faced death for their beliefs. He was no martyr, but he couldn't let the chamber's secrets die with him. "This isn't God's work," he said, his voice shaking but defiant. "This is cruelty hidden behind his name." Lorenzo's smile was chilling, a predator's grin. "God's work is whatever keeps his church standing," he replied. "And you, Matteo, are a threat to that." The priest stepped closer, his robes brushing the stone floor. and Matteo realized there was no reasoning with a man who saw pain as divine. In a desperate move, Matteo bolted for the door, the ledger clutched tightly. Lorenzo lunged, his hand grazing Matteo's shoulder, but the scribe's fear gave him speed. He stumbled into the tunnels, the lantern's light bouncing wildly off the walls. The labyrinth was a maze of dead ends and forgotten passages, but Matteo ran, driven by the need to survive, to expose the truth. Behind him, Lorenzo's footsteps echoed, steady and unrelenting. The chase was more than physical. It was a battle between light and shadow, between one man's conscience and a system that thrived on silence. Matteo's flight led him to a hidden stairwell, one he'd never noticed in his years at the Vatican. It spiraled upward, toward the surface, toward hope. But hope was fragile, and Lorenzo was close. As Matteo climbed, he thought of Giovanni, the old scribe who had warned him. Had Giovanni once stood in this chamber, faced this choice? Had he chosen silence to save himself? Matteo's lungs burned, but he pushed on, the ledger's weight a reminder of why he couldn't stop. The truth was a fire in his chest, and he would carry it to the world or die trying. At the top of the stairwell, Matteo emerged into a courtyard, the night air cold against his sweat-soaked skin. The Vatican loomed around him, its spires piercing the starry sky. For a moment, he felt free. But freedom was an illusion. Lorenzo appeared at the stairwell's entrance, his face a mask of fury. "There's nowhere to run," he said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. Matteo's eyes darted to the surrounding buildings, the archives, the Basilica, the Pope's quarters. He could try to hide, but Lorenzo's reach was long, and the church's eyes were everywhere. In that moment, Matteo made a choice. He would not run forever. He would take the ledger to someone outside the Vatican, someone who could spread the truth without fear of the church's wrath. He thought of a printer in Venice, a man known for publishing works the church deemed dangerous. If Matteo could reach him, the ledger's secrets could be printed, shared, and preserved. But Venice was far, and Lorenzo was close. Matteo slipped into the shadows of the courtyard, moving toward the Vatican's outer gates. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of torchlight, felt like a threat. The night was alive with danger, and Matteo was its prey. As he reached the gates, a hand grabbed his arm. Matteo's heart stopped, expecting Lorenzo's cold grip. But it was Giovanni, his face pale and lined with fear. "I told you to stop," Giovanni whispered, his voice urgent. "But you didn't listen. Now you must go. Take this." He pressed a small pouch into Matteo's hand. "Coins, enough for a horse and passage to Venice." "Lorenzo will never stop," Giovanni said. "But the truth might." Matteo stared at the old man, realizing Giovanni had been waiting for someone like him, someone brave or foolish enough to act. With Giovanni's help, Matteo slipped past the gates, disappearing into the Roman night. The ledger was heavy in his hands, its pages a burden and a beacon. He didn't know if he'd reach Venice, if the printer would listen, or if the church would crush him before the truth could spread. But for the first time, Matteo felt a flicker of purpose. The chamber below was no longer just a room. It was a symbol of a truth the church had buried for centuries. And Matteo, the quiet scribe, was its unlikely messenger. The road to Venice was long and treacherous, fraught with bandits, spies, and the ever-present shadow of Lorenzo. Matteo traveled by night, hiding in barns and forests, the ledger never leaving his side. Each step was a gamble, each breath a defiance of the church's power. He thought of the victims named in the ledger, men and women who had faced the chamber's horrors and found no justice. Their stories drove him forward, their silenced voices a chorus in his mind. Weeks later, Matteo reached Venice, his body worn but his spirit unbroken. The printer, a grizzled man named Aldo, listened to his story with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. When Matteo showed him the ledger, Aldo's eyes widened. "This could bring the church to its knees," he said, his voice low. "Or it could get us both killed." But Aldo was no stranger to risk. He agreed to print the ledger's contents, disguising them as a fictional tale to evade the church's censors. Matteo stayed in Venice, helping Aldo set the type, each letter a step toward justice. As the first copies rolled off the press, Matteo felt a weight lift. The chamber below was no longer a secret buried beneath the Vatican. It was a story, a warning, a call to question the untouchable. But the church was not so easily defied. Word of the fictional tale reached Rome, and Lorenzo was dispatched to silence its source. Matteo knew his time was short. He entrusted the ledger to Aldo, urging him to keep printing, to keep spreading the truth. "They can kill me," Matteo said, "but they can't kill this." One foggy morning, as Matteo walked along Venice's canals, Lorenzo found him. The priest's blade was swift, and Matteo fell, the water turning red beneath him. But the ledger lived on. Aldo's presses continued, and the story of the chamber below spread across Europe, whispered in taverns, debated in secret meetings, and read by candlelight in homes far from Rome. The church denounced it as heresy, but the damage was done. The spark Matteo had carried had become a flame, one that would burn through centuries, exposing the cost of unchecked power. And so, the chamber below remains a shadow in history. Its iron door rusted, but never fully closed. Matteo's name is forgotten, but his courage echoes in every question asked, every secret uncovered. The Pope's torture chamber was more than a room. It was a testament to what happens when faith becomes a weapon and truth becomes a crime. As we stand in the light of today, we must ask ourselves, what chambers still lie hidden, their secrets waiting for another Matteo to bring them to the surface? The answer, my friends, is out there in the shadows we're too afraid to face.